Okay, guys, I wanted to do a review video for Paper 1A, but we will also be touching on some um, elements of supply. Okay, so I wanted to give you this tutorial. It should be about maybe 10 to 15 minutes about how to correctly answer a Paper 1A. We did this about 2 weeks ago, but it's worth reviewing, and we want to make sure we totally understand Paper 1A before we move on to Paper 1B. Okay, what you see on the screen here is a mark scheme. First thing we want to look at is the question. It says explain the difference between a movement along an existing supply curve and a shift of the supply curve. And this is the question we did in class, but these steps and this analysis and walkthrough can be applied to any Paper 1A question. So first thing we want to do is remember our acronym DEED, which stands for definitions, explanation, examples, and diagram. Now, you don't need to do them in that order. In fact, a lot of people kind of do a DDEE process in which they right away give the definitions followed by a diagram, and then they explain themselves. They walk us through the diagram, and insert relevant examples. Whatever your order is fine, as long as it produces a understandable, coherent, and appropriate response. Okay, so let's look at this question, and I want to first go over what the mark scheme is for this one. And there's a mark scheme created for every test question, whether it be during the external testing or during midterms and final exams, and even summative assessments in the economics department here at Chiba Dwight. The mark schemes are created so that teachers have uniform marking, and all the teachers are looking for the same elements in your response. So here we go. Answers to the question about movement of supply curve, movement along supply curve versus shift of supply curve. We say answers should include a definition of supply, an explanation that a change in the price of a good itself leads to a movement along the existing supply curve, because the price of the good is one of the axes, specifically the y-axis. Some reference to ceteris paribus should be made, whether explicitly or implicitly. I think I would accept you saying that there's a movement along the supply curve, all else being equal, or all other things equal, or you could say ceteris paribus. You need a correctly labeled diagram showing a movement along the supply curve and the resulting change in price and quantity supplied. I usually recommend that for these simple micro questions that a student try to incorporate some specific numbers there. I feel that it's a little bit easier to explain yourself if you are using specific numbers rather than P1, P2, and Q1, Q2, although that is also acceptable. Next, we see an explanation that a change in any of the non-price determinants of supply will lead to a shift of the supply curve to either the left or the right. Within that explanation, I think an example is expected, such as a change in technology, an increase or decrease in resource costs. Lastly, you see that a correctly labeled diagram showing a shift of the supply curve for a good should also be included. Now, I mentioned in class that perhaps you could get away with only creating one diagram for this question rather than two, to show both movement and shift on a diagram. But be careful there, because if there's too many arrows, too many letters, and it's not well explained, you could lose points on either your diagram or your explanation. There's a few elements that we put in the may include category. These are not 100% necessary, but would often be in a top response. Definition of law of supply, examples of specific goods to illustrate movements and shifts. So rather than saying a good or a product. You give some specific examples of products that operate under the law of supply, which would be probably almost every product. And then lastly, in the may include, the demand curve can be included in your diagrams so as to show a change in equilibrium price and quantity, although that's not 100% necessary. So let's move to a sample response. I kind of just grabbed one at random. Let's zoom in a little bit. And this one was peer reviewed, which is a great exercise to help students identify the different parts of a response and to help students also understand how these are scored. So if we start off with, unfortunately, a poor definition, you can see the pink highlighted sentence says the supply curve is a curve which shows us the quantity of supply when the price or other non-price determinants change. I think the student probably understands what it is, but this definition is incorrect and also somewhat unclear. Supply should be defined as the willingness and ability of producers to produce at each price in a given time period. We mentioned that law of supply could also be defined, and then if you strictly wanted to define what a supply curve is, you can mention something like it's a graphical representation of supply, or a graphical representation showing the law of supply. But keep it simple. I recommend giving just the definition of supply, and then perhaps the law of supply could be contained somewhere in your response, most likely in the explanation. So here we start off a little weak with the definition. But let's move on to the diagram. I think the first diagram here looks pretty good. She has price and quantity clearly labeled on the axes, and she shows an upward sloping supply curve. We can see 2 points A and B that are on the supply curve and are also referenced in her explanation. Her explanation says diagram 1 is a diagram of a movement along an existing supply curve. Should say curve there. It means when the quantity of supply goes up, it will become more costly. Now at first I didn't understand that, but if you read the green part, I think it will make sense. Also, we notice in parentheses, she says from point A to point B. It's good to reference your diagrams. So the green part provides some clarification for this term costly. She says to illustrate, when Coca-Cola Company would like to produce more cola, the company must pay more to increase the supply because they should hire more workers or build a bigger factory or get more resources to produce the product. I actually think that's correct and a good answer. We mentioned in class that the reason why producers need a higher price to produce more quantity is because the factors of production and or the resources they need to produce that are becoming more scarce and therefore more costly to utilize. A classic example is an oil company. Perhaps the easy to get oil or accessible oil in places like Saudi Arabia or the Middle East can be extracted relatively cheaply by the company. Therefore, they only require a low price for that oil. But as they want to increase supply, they have to either use more costly methods or increase their productive capacity by building bigger machines or, like this student says, build a bigger factory or hire more workers. So actually I like the word costly there. So I think the explanation is pretty good so far. Now the example, which I'll circle back in the end and talk about, the example is actually a little weak. She's talking about Coca-Cola, and while it's true that Coca-Cola does hire workers and perhaps builds bigger factories, we can get even more specific. We can say that Coca-Cola invests in more capital equipment like robotics or automation or computer systems. You want to err on the side of specific when it comes to these examples. You'll never lose points for being more specific. But let's move on within the explanation. As a result, the movement along the existing supply curve means producing additional product, and it also costs more. So repeating yourself a little bit, which is okay, not a big deal. Diagram 2 also looks good. There's now there's two supply curves. I think it would have been a little stronger for her to use an arrow here to accompany her example of the shift. But let's see what she does to explain. She says diagram 2 is a diagram of a shift of a supply curve which is caused by non-price determinants. Now, to be clear, she means caused by changes in non-price determinants. Non-price determinants contain technology, resources, and other related products. That's a little vague. And then policy and author. So that last part, I really don't know what the student means here. Policy and author. I'm thinking author is maybe an incorrect word, or maybe just the handwriting is obscuring it. But policy I take to mean perhaps taxes and subsidies. But rather than using the vague term policy, the student should have mentioned taxes and subsidies. But even listing off those non-price determinants, while it's okay for the explanation part, does not make for a suitable example, which we'll talk about at the end. Once either of them has changed, she says, even though the price doesn't change, the quantity of supply changes. I think I understand that there. Not the best wording ever, but she's saying that basically there's, if you look at her diagram, there's one line indicating price, and then there's corresponding two different quantities. There's a quantity at point A and a quantity that corresponds to point B. Now her diagram could be stronger here. Actually, both diagrams could be stronger if she included prices and specific prices and quantities, or at least P1, Q1, Q2, that kind of thing. That would allow her to refer to the diagram and walk us through that diagram a little better. Now she attempts to provide an example of non-price determinant change. She says, for example, also about the Coca-Cola company, if the price of soda goes down, the demand of consumers also goes down, then the company have to decrease the supply since they should keep their profit. This explanation is completely incorrect. I think the student is fumbling for an answer a little bit here, which is fine for a paper 1 practice. But we want to remember that price changes are not non-price determinants. And this is not an example of a change in a non-price determinant. An example of a change in a non-price determinant, as I said before, might be a specific improvement in soda technology, or on the other hand, something that would reduce supply would be the price of a resource cost goes up, specifically sugar or vanilla, if it's a vanilla type soda. Be specific and provide real world examples. So in my example, if soda producing technology improves, supply curve should shift to the right or outward. If a resource cost goes up, there should be an inward shift of supply curve. So the explanation during the second part is incorrect and does not demonstrate thorough knowledge of what non-price determinants are and how they affect supply. So having looked at this, let's now take a look at the assessment criteria. So we have 4 levels. Level 0 is basically if there's nothing on the page or just a few words on the page. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Level 1, there is little understanding of the specific demands of the question. There's no relevant terms. There's very little knowledge of theory. And you'll notice what's missing from level 1 is examples, diagrams. The examples and diagrams are completely missing from level 1. And therefore, if you have neither of those, you would be stuck in level 1, or at least stuck in level 2. Let's look specifically at level 2, because I actually think level 1, for all practical purposes, only happens when the question is answered completely incorrectly. Maybe the student, in this example, the student gives you everything we need to know about demand, for example, rather than supply. I think level 2 is the one to really focus on here, because this is some of everything, some understanding, some relevant economic terms, and some knowledge of economic theory, with some, or we could probably say, multiple errors. Now you'll notice also missing in level 2 is diagrams and examples. However, just having a basic diagram or an attempt at an example doesn't mean you'll move from a level 2 to a level 3 response. If diagrams are incorrect and examples are not specific or appropriate, we could still be stuck in level 2. In fact, in order to get to level 3, it has to be appropriate diagrams that are clearly and well marked, labeled. And a lot of times a title can help you there as well. And also, examples need to be there. So really, a level 3 response is like a really good response. It's a very complete response. And the only difference between 3 and 4 is that 4, as we see in this criteria, represents a clear understanding of the specific demands of the question, and examples are used effectively, diagrams are applied effectively. Now, we all understand, anyone who lives and studies or teaches in the IB, that these descriptors are not perfect. I mean, they are vague. So really, it's up to the teacher's discretion between level 3 and 4. From my experience, it comes down to the strength of the diagrams and the strength of the real-world examples. And so if the diagram is like perfect and the real-world examples are really strengthen your explanation, then we can get up to level 4. 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 is possible, is within reach. But even though the language of this assessment criteria doesn't indicate it so clearly, there is quite a bit of difference between a level 3 and level 4 response. I think for our early summatives here, or our midterm, getting a level 3 response on paper A is very, very good. Perhaps some of you will get level 4s. That's not by any means impossible, but I think getting to a level 3 is considered highly successful at this point. So where does the student sample that we just looked at fit in? Well, this is where it gets not so straightforward to mark these. It's not a multiple choice. It's a process. So first thing I look at is the definitions. Do they have all the relevant definitions? Now, this question only really required 1 or possibly 2 definitions. Unfortunately, this student does not have either of those. So we can't say relevant economic terms are defined. But that doesn't mean the student receives instantly a level 1 response. That would be too harsh. But as we move forward here, understand that lack of clear and appropriate definitions will prevent this student from receiving a high score. Let's move on. Are the diagrams good? Well, they're okay, right? They're not incorrect, but they could be more detailed, like I said, with quantity and price. I also, as a personal preference, and I'm sure other examiners and teachers might agree, titles for diagrams can help your explanation a lot. So rather than saying diagram 1, diagram 2, you can use just a brief phrase or short sentence to provide a title for your diagram, which is one of the easiest ways to improve your explanation. So anyways, she has basic diagrams. So far we have poor definitions and okay diagrams. So let's think about her explanation, which her explanation is where a student explains economic theory. Her explanation is good in one part, but pretty weak in the other part. So I think that qualifies as some relevant economic terms are defined. Some knowledge of relevant economic theory is given. That's what I meant to say. So lastly, let's look at examples. She mentions Coca-Cola in both the price movement and the change in a non-price determinant. However, both of her attempts to use an example fell short. And so I don't think examples are used effectively. I do think examples are used. So this becomes difficult to mark, but the definitions are in level 1. The explanation is in level 2. The diagrams, if we're generous, I'd say are in level 3. They're certainly not in level 4. And her examples, perhaps in level 3 if a teacher is generous, but some teachers or examiners might throw out this example altogether because it was incorrectly used for the non-price determinants and it wasn't super specific for the price change paragraph. So what we've seen recently with examiners is they're very, very strict on examples, and they'd most likely throw this example out. Therefore, because there's a pretty an adequate diagram, however poor definitions, and some relevant economic terms defined, this student would probably receive a level 2 score. And now we just would need to decide, is it 4 points, 5 points, or 6 points? Well, what it comes down for me here is how severe are the errors, because this level includes includes the descriptor that says there are some errors, and I think the errors here are pretty severe and damage the student's demonstration of economic knowledge. Therefore, unfortunately, well, it's only a practice paper 1, so it's okay. I think the student would receive a 4 or a 5 out of 10. It's a level 2 response, but there are several problems. And now you can see that the student, the peer grading, I think gave it a 6 out of 10, and I think I was 1 or 2 points below that. The student that marked her said the explanation was very good, but perhaps did not examine it carefully enough, as well as the diagrams. So 6 of 10 is kind of close, but I think this would actually be 1 or 2 points lower if we're to give accurate scores here. So I think this is a good practice one. I just want to circle back to something I said I would repeat before. A big part of these is about your diagrams and your examples, because these are human beings marking these. Human beings like to look at pictures. They like diagrams to be perfect. And then the examples are the thing that can most strongly demonstrate your economic knowledge. I mean, the theory has to be there. That's true. The theory has to be there. But theory, for better or worse, can be memorized and put on a page. But it takes strong real-world examples to convince the reader that you understand the theory and that you're applying it correctly to each question. Okay, that's it for now. The next video will most likely be dealing with paper 1B, where we move beyond analysis and explanation and into evaluation. So I'll see you guys then.